For those of you who have not been with us, I've started to review each week. As I said, it's going to get harder and harder to review what we've done as we get further along. The first mitzvah, Pru'ervu, argues that the fundamental starting point in Judaism is to learn how to give, to learn how to be a creator. The second mitzvah, Brit Milah, speaks about sacrifice, the sacrifice we're prepared to give to God in order to have this relationship. The third, Gid HaNasheh, is about power, but spiritual power, refraining from eating the Gid HaNasheh. The fourth mitzvah was Kiddush HaChodesh, Sanctifying the New Moon, which was teaching the lesson of sort of optimism, teaching the lesson that things can change just as the moon changes. Every individual has the power to change, and therefore political situations can also change. That was the message that was needed to be heard by the Jewish people before they left Egypt, that they could in fact be successful. The fifth mitzvah, we are already moving to the Karbanot, and then we talked about the Karban Pesach in a number of different ways, about how it had to be roasted a certain way, that had to deal with sort of miracles being hidden. We talked about how it couldn't be broken, that spoke about concepts of unity, and how everyone had to eat it together. The last week we spoke about the 16th mitzvah in the Sefer HaChinuch, which had to do with, more than anything else, had to do with the mitzvah of action, learning how actions and habits help us develop. And as I've said from the very beginning, is we're going to try to see 10 mitzvot, that the first 10 mitzvot that the Torah speaks about in chronological order as sort of an alternative 10 commandments because of the fundamental lessons that they teach us. Today, we're going to talk about the mitzvah of not eating Chametz on Pesach, because we're moving, right, as I said, the Sefer HaChinuch goes according to the Parshiot, so we're in Parshat Bo, and there will be Bashalach, we'll hit Yitro, and so we will now talk about the mitzvah of refraining from Chametz. Next week, which is sort of a parallel, a mirror image, is the positive mitzvah of eating matzah, and then the story of telling the story, the mitzvah of telling the story, the Haggadah, and then that will round out our first 10 commandments. As you see on the source sheet, the mitzvah of not eating chametz has many different individual, unique mitzvot attached to it. You see, it's the mitzvah number 9, which I brought in the Sefer HaChinuch, number 11, 12, 19, 20. We'll get to 117 in a moment. These are all various elements or aspects of that mitzvah of not eating chametz. So you probably know some of them, right? You shouldn't have chametz be seen in your house. It should not be found in your house. You have a mitzvah of putting it aside, right? You have a mitzvah of searching it, finding it, burning it. There's the mitzvah of not having mixtures of chametz. Right? That's different than other mitzvot. For example, other foods, we have the concept of nullification, right? Bitul, if there's a small amount of something non-kosher that falls into a large pot, it can be nullified. Not so with chametz. So that's another one of them. There's about 5 or 6 different mitzvot, which is actually quite relevant if you think about it, that there are so many mitzvot connected to chametz, because we go crazy about chametz more so than anything else. We have many serious prohibitions with regards to chametz. And the question that I want to sort of spend the first part of the class is why? What's so bad about chametz? Sure, I'm sure some of us have already, this is unlike Gid HaNasheh, where there's not so many sources. Chametz, I'm sure every single year you hear a new reason why chametz is terrible. We'll talk about some of those reasons. Some of the ones I'm sure you've seen, and maybe a new one or two. And then all this, of course, begs another question. If chametz is so bad, what's the question that we also have to answer? What's the other question we have to answer, which is exactly that? If it's so terrible, we're going to see the Yetzer Hara. So it's only terrible for Pesach. So we have to ask 2 questions then. Why is it only terrible for Pesach, right? If it's the Yetzer Hara, or if it's pride, those seem to be qualities that are negative all year long. So one question is, Why is it terrible just for Pesach, but it's okay the rest of the year? And you can even strengthen the question a little bit further, because the continuation of Pesach after Sfirat HaOmer is Shavuos. And Dafka you have to bring, right? The rest of the year, you don't have to eat bread, right? The Torah is not Atkins' diet. You're allowed to eat bread, but on Pesach, on Shavuos, it's part of the Karbanot. So if it's so terrible, then why is it then permitted at other times of the year, and why is it commanded at other on Shavuot? So, as usual, we'll start with the Sefer Chinuch. I brought a couple of the sources. If you have your books, if you would like to, and you can see the other ones that are brought, I'll just read them to you, actually. So, Mitzvah 9, which I brought for you, is the mitzvah of removing chametz. That's going to deal with the bitul, the biur, right? The burning, the searching. Mitzvah number 11 is you can't have it in your possession, right? We often call that, right, bal yimatzeh, it cannot be found. Mitzvah 12 is you can't eat even the tarovas. You can't, even a mixture, chametz, even in a small amount with some other food. You may think it's just the food. No, it's also counted. Mitzvah 19, I'm just reading them because I didn't put them all on the sheet for you. Mitzvah 19 is not to eat chametz, right? It's an obvious one, not to eat chametz. And Mitzvah 20 is what we call, no chametz may be seen during Pesach, which is the bal yira'eh. We usually put the two together. Bal yimatzeh and bal yira'eh, you can't see, and you can't have present. And we're going to talk about that as well, because what's the difference between those two concepts? So let's begin with mitzvah number 9. Mitzvah number 9, I'll read in English, but you can see the Hebrew above. The commandment of disposing chametz. It's a mitzvah to remove all leavened bread from our dwellings on the 14th day of Nisan, as it is stated. But on the first day, you shall dispose of leaven from your homes. The Hebrew here is interesting. It's not lechem, right? It's not bread. It's the leaven. It's the suor. It's that which gives the rising. This will be relevant a little bit later when we see something that the Rambam says. But just keep that in the back of your mind. It's the leavening agent that's the problem. From the roots of this commandment it is in order that we should remember the miracles of Egypt as it is written with the Pesach sacrifice. We've already seen this. All the previous mitzvot we've spoken about already with regards to Pesach all have to do with to remember this miracle, remember this miracle, remember this miracle. This is the exact same reason that he gives here in mitzvah number 9. But he gives us another motivation in mitzvah number 11. The chametz should not be found in our possession. The bal yimatzeh. Chametz cannot be found in our possession on all the days of Pesach. We have the source again. 7 days shall leaven not be found in your homes. We're going to come back to that verse again. Shall not be found in your homes. And the sages, may their memory be blessed, elucidated in Psachim that it is not specifically one's home, but rather anything that is in one's possession, and not specifically leaven, which makes rise, but the same is true of any grain that has risen, as leaven and leavened grain products are one and the same concerning the matters of its prohibition. He then continues, also still in mitzvah 11, Mishorshei HaMitzvah. Right? For those of you who are new, the Sefer Chinuch always has a structure. He gives us the source of the mitzvah, what psukim it appears in, where it appears in the Gemara, and then he tells us Mishorshei, from the roots of the mitzvah. What is the reasoning behind the mitzvah? From the roots of the commandment, that we should always remember the miracles that were done for us in the Exodus to Egypt, as we've already spoken about. And we should also remember that which occurred to us with this matter as a result of the haste we left Egypt, the haste of the Exodus. We baked the dough into matzah. They could not wait until it rose, and therefore they baked the dough. In other words, what's an important element? What is the new thing that the Sefer Chinuch is teaching us at this point in time? There's something about the haste. We spoke about this a little bit with the Karban Pesach as well, that they wanted to get out of there as fast as possible, and so roasting is faster than cooking, and it was to teach us the importance of appreciating the moment. But now he says something slightly different. He's now saying appreciate the concept of speed. right, of alacrity, of moving fast. How are we to understand that, really? So that's why I brought mitzvah number 117. In mitzvah number 117, it's not about Pesach. It's about karbanot. In mitzvah dealing with karbanot, you are not allowed to bring chametz and honey. That's the mitzvah number 117. But he gives us a reason why you can't bring the chametz in mitzvah number 117, which will then hopefully we can apply back to our understanding here. So, if you go down to the page, the middle of the page, mitzvah 117. We are not to offer leaven or honey on top of the altar, as it is stated in Vayikra. For any leaven and any honey that you shall not burn, from it is fire to the Lord. And the prevention is repeated at the beginning of the verse. Any meal offering that you offer to the Lord, you shall not make it chametz. And honey is a general name for well-known honey. He talks about date honey is what we're referring to. Also the sap that exudes from any other sweet fruits. And so you can't have the honey or chametz in your things. Now he's going to give us the reason. Yeah.
That's all year, right?
Yeah, all year. Anytime you bring a carbon, except we know, except for the exceptions, such as for Shavuot, you can't bring anything leavened. And with regards to honey, you can never have honey. It's interesting, by the way. What can you have?
Yes, but the honey refers to date honey, not to the honey from the bee.
Correct. Yeah, it's date honey, but it's still honey. It's what's the date honey? It's Ceylon, right? Exactly. So you can't have Ceylon. You also can't bring honey from a bee, but that was not what they were necessarily thinking of in that instance. What can you have, though, by the way, which is interesting? Oh, well, there's a whole series of different things, but to put on your carbon, so one of the things you can, and we'll see actually the Rambam speaks about this as well, and he gives a reason why, is you can have salt. Why are you allowed to have salt on your carbonot? So the mystics say there's a Kabbalistic reason why you're allowed to have salt. The whole idea of when you bring a carbon is that you are, in a sense, saying, I'm bringing myself. I'm giving myself to God. So why can't you bring honey? Sefer Chinuch doesn't give this answer. He gives a more practical answer. But why can't you bring honey when you bring a carbon? So you can't bring honey because it masks the taste, right? If you put honey, if you put these strong, very sweet items on food, you taste more of that than the actual food. So you can't mask who you are. You can't sort of just put on some honey and assume that that's sufficient and that's enough. But why are you allowed to put salt? Salt also changes the taste of the food. But what also does salt do? So I remember once speaking to my grandmother, and she told me that when she used to eat watermelon, she used to actually eat it with salty cheese. And she said, why do you eat watermelon with salty cheese? Because if you put salt on something, it brings out the internal flavor. Right? That's why we, of course, salt our meat, because it actually pulls out. It brings out the blood. But you don't want that necessarily when you're obviously that's not the same purpose when you put the salt in the watermelon, but the salt brings out the internal flavor. And so the Kabbalists say you put salt on your carbon, that's permissible because that's not covering who you really are. It's finding out the best of who you are, who you're really, so you're allowed to do that. Now that's not the answer that the Sefer Chinuch gives us. Sefer Chinuch now continues on at the bottom of the page. He's a very honest individual, the Sefer Chinuch. The roots of this commandment are very hidden to find even a small hint from them. He says it's not as obvious as all the other mitzvot. However, since I've already made known at the opening of my words, meaning in his introduction, he says he's writing this for his kid. Remember, he's writing the Sefer Chinuch for his children to get them excited about looking at the Torah portion each week. I write it to accustom the youth and give them explanations at the beginning of their coming to hear the words of the book. They're coming to hear the Torah reading, so I want to sort of excite them a little bit, so I give them a little bit of taste of what the meaning is. And I don't want to let the commandments be like words of a sealed book, that they're somehow hidden, that they don't have any meaning whatsoever, because that may be, educationally speaking, may be problematic. It may turn the child away. If the child comes and doesn't think there's any meaning, so he'll sort of walk away. So he says, I have to give something, but I don't really know what to give. So he writes, very frankly, hence I will write everything that first comes into my thoughts, and you know me. Once you know my intention, let not the critic criticize me. Meaning, I don't really know the answer, but I'm going to give you some possible suggestions. The next page. And I will say that the matter of all the sacrifices is to arouse the thoughts of one that offers them, and according to that act, he shall take its similarities into its soul. Hence, in distancing Chametz, which is made with great delay, right? Chametz takes time, you have to leave it out. He will take the similarity from a sacrifice to acquire the trait of alacrity, of lightness, of speed. What do we call that? Zrizut, right? Zrizus lemitzvah is what he's teaching us. That's why you don't eat chametz on Pesach, to learn the concept of Zrizus lemitzvah. He then quotes, right, be light as the eagle, swift as the deer. This is from Pirkei Avot. Mighty as the lion, to do the will of your creator. And we're supposed to run to do things. We're supposed to run to do mitzvah. That's Vayashkem, right? Avraham wakes up. He doesn't wait. He has a difficult task in front of him of potentially sacrificing his son Yitzchak. He doesn't wait. All of us, maybe not all of us, maybe I'm projecting. Some of us are procrastinators. If we have a difficult task in front of us, we don't do that first. We try to wait. Avraham doesn't wait until midday. He runs first thing in the morning. By the way, all the social scientists tell us as well, if you do have a difficult task ahead of you, you should do it first thing in the morning. That's when you have the most energy. That's when you have a chance of overcoming the challenge. And by the way, they say something also which is very interesting. And I sense it myself as well. They say the best thing you can do when you have a big task, like a huge monumental task. Let's say you want to write a book. So usually people don't write books because they procrastinate because the job is just too big. They can't see the potential of making any progress on such a big task. So they say the best thing you do is just start. Just start doing it. You'll then see a little bit of success, and then you'll do it a little bit more and a little bit more. And they say, but it's not just that you see a little bit of success. The human mind is such a way that you get something called dissonance, that if you start to do something and you didn't finish it, you'll then be frustrated by that, and you'll continue to try working on it until it's finished. And so the best thing to do is to trick yourself. If you have a very big job, say to yourself, I'm not going to finish the job. I'm just going to spend 2 minutes doing it. And then once you do 2 minutes, this happens, by the way, with cleaning. I find it, sometimes at the end of the day, I just want a cup of coffee. But the sink is a little bit dirty, and I don't like having a cup of coffee where I take the sink, from the sink. It's going to bother me. So I'll clean a few of the dishes in order to have that cup of coffee. But once I do a few of the dishes, now the sink looks really nice, but the counter, in contrast, looks terrible. So then I clean the counter a little bit, and now I can sit down for my cup of coffee. But now the counter looks really nice, and the floor, in contrast, looks terrible. And so I start doing the floor. And then I'm painting, and then I'm, just have this little bit of cup of coffee.
And the coffee got cold.
And the coffee, of course, gets cold. So, but there is a logic to it. There's a logic of just get started with something, and you'll be surprised. The human mind is such that it will propel you to do something even though previously you wouldn't have thought wanting to do it. So Zrizus LaMitzvah has a very positive practical benefit. Rav Hutner says there's also a theological element to it as well. He says every mitzvah has time. Right? You shake a lulav, it takes a certain amount of time. Not long, but it takes a little bit of time. Tefillah, it takes a certain amount of time. Everything takes amount of time. The Jews left the chipazon. What does it mean to leave fast? What does it mean to run to do a mitzvah? So he says, what you're doing is you're taking a mitzvah that normally takes this long, and you're condensing it into this long. That creates a greater intensity of the mitzvah itself. So when you do zrizus the mitzvah, when you rush to do a mitzvah, one of the things that was always very shocking to me, and I remember one of the first times I was in Meir Sharim, and you see people running, right? Holding their hats, running really, really fast. And I was like, where is everyone running to? And it's not even if you're running to something. This is based upon Rav Hutner's teaching, that there's a value in running, meaning living in a more intense way. There's also a value, of course, in going slow and smelling the flowers, right? Nothing is necessarily rejects one out of the other. But he says that if you do whatever you do and you do it in a speedy way, you create greater intensity. The Kabbalists say when you do something speedy, in chipazon, and that's what happened with the Jews, is they did something outside of time. Meaning they did it not the normal way you would do something. They did it extra fast, and extra fast sort of took them out of time. And once you take something out of time, it then becomes eternal as well. So there's deeper points to this concept of doing something fast. And not eating the chametz is this concept of zrizus l'mitzvah. He goes on, and he talks now about why honey. And I'm going to just talk about honey for a few moments because it's going to come back and help us when we get to the Rambam on this topic. So in the middle of that first paragraph still, he helps explain why on Shavuot it's okay to have leavening. And we are obligated in the matter with the meal offering of individuals more than with the communal meal offering, since discouragement and laziness are found more with the individual, as the many will flag one another. In other words, when you hang out with more people, right, you very often are inspired by their actions. So if you're a lazy person and you go and hang out with a group that is not lazy, they will encourage you to correct your laziness. And so it's less worried of a communal offering, like on Shavuot, that you'll have this concern of laziness, but only as an individual. So the individual carbonot, they have to be without chametz, but the communal, it's less of a concern. He then gives an example. He says, well, what about Shabbat, where there is a communal, but that's also matzah? And he says, yes, it's communal, and you could have bread at that point in time, but since it's every single Shabbat, the additional value to zrizut is continuity, right? Is consistency. That you have to either do something very, very fast, or you have to do it consistent. If you're writing a book, you either have to say, okay, I'm now going to get started right away, or every day I'll write 15 minutes or 20 minutes, and that consistency helps. There's an interesting machloket. What is the most important verse in the entire Torah? Have you ever seen this? It's in the introduction to the Ein Yaakov, which is all the Agadata of the Gemara. And there's an argument, a three-way argument of what is the most important pasuk in the entire Torah. What would you say is the most important verse? The most important verse in the entire Torah. Yes. Emet, which, yeah. So some people say that God created the world, right? That's because we're all then therefore created by God. Others say, v'hafta kamocha, love your neighbor as yourself. Others say, v'hafta et Hashem Elokecha, love the Lord your God. That these are all pretty weighty, possibilities of what is the most important verse. There's someone by the name of Ben Pazi. Ben Pazi says the most important verse in the entire Torah is what we say on Shabbat. Yeah. Well, it's close. It's the word tamid is correct. He says that you bring the tamid sacrifice. Tamid is always every single Shabbat. Right? You bring the sacrifice. He says that's the most important. Why? Because all these other things, love the Lord your God, love your neighbor, they don't mean anything if you can't create consistency. Meaning we're not going to rely just on a moment of inspiration. A moment of inspiration and then it's gone. Right? So we can't build an entire society on inspiration. We have to build it on consistency and commitment and continually love the Lord your God, even if it's at a lower level. But if you do it for your entire lifetime, you'll eventually have a much bigger impact than if you just do it once incredibly intensely. Okay, now let's continue with what he says about honey, which is a little bit interesting. And regarding the distancing of honey, now we're used to the Sefer Chinuch and others giving us this incredibly wonderful sort of allegorical, symbolic, spiritual, Kabbalistic meaning. What does he say the problem with honey is? We shall say to the tender children, in order to discipline them, that the cause is to make a similarity that a person should minimize running after food that is sweet to the palate, like the custom of the gluttons and the drunkards that are always drawn after everything sweet. And he should place in his heart to seek only foods that are beneficial for the body, necessary for its sustenance, that protect the health and the limbs. We don't bring honey, he says, because we should remind ourselves that we shouldn't have too much sugar in our diet. It's actually, ahead of its time, and it's obviously very accurate. All the literature today tells us exactly how destructive sugar is. And of course, that literature is often hard to find because the sugar industry is incredibly powerful. If you ever look at the labels on the back of any of your foods, at least in the United States, they will tell you, how much sodium you have, and then they'll tell you the percentage. This many milligrams, and the percentage of how much you should have for a daily amount, and how much fat, and how. They won't write it for sugar. They'll put the amount, 10 grams. But Does anyone know what that, is that good? Is it bad? You don't have any idea. You need to know this is 5% of your daily intake. And the sugar industry has an exception that they lobbied in the United States, at least, to make sure that you can never put the percentage of how much sugar you should have, percentage-wise, on the back of the labels. So anyway, he's ahead of his time.
The
And
ingredients they list, like if there's the most sugar, like in the cereal, they'll put that first. I think that's
yeah, they do have to do it in order, although the cereals get around this also. What they do is they break their sugars up into 5 sugars. They have white sugar, brown sugar, syrup, this. And so what they do is they're able to sort of lower what it looks like the amount of sugar, but it's not always number one ingredient, when in fact it usually is the number one ingredient, but spread out. Okay, so that's his first piece of advice, is that you should be careful about the honey in that regard. Now, honey, as I mentioned, is significant for another reason, and I'm going to just say this. Yeah, okay. We'll come back to the Sefer Chinuch in a moment. I want to talk about the Rambam for just a second. I didn't bring the Rambam here for you, but it's from the Mor Nevuchim, the 3rd section, chapter 46. So the Rambam says in that chapter, he talks about all the motivations behind Egyptian Avodah Zarah. And when he describes Egyptian Avodah Zarah, of course, he starts off by the sheep. Right, he says they believed that their sheep were gods. Not only did they believe their sheep were gods, the Rambam says actually they believed the sheep were reincarnations of human beings. And that's why you didn't also kill them, right? Because that would be killing, your ancestors of sorts. And so when the Jews come along and they not only sacrifice the sheep, but they also would put the blood on the doorpost. It was such, in such contradistinction to what the Egyptians felt, that you had to protect and worship and make sure that there's never a blood drop, because that's part of your ancestor. And they'd say, that which you think is saving you is killing you, and vice versa. That which you think we're killing ourselves was actually redeeming us. In his list, and then he talks about other forms of Avodah Zarah, including other forms that took place in Egyptian society. He says most Egyptians didn't have some of the animals you were allowed to sacrifice were bear, and lions, right? Most of us don't have those. So he says that then they would sacrifice smaller things like chickens and things along those lines. And he says, and in Egyptian society and most pre-modern societies, they would always put on all their carbonot, you want to guess? Chametz and honey. They always put those things in there. And there might be different reasons why, but they always did that. And says the Rambam, and because they always did that, we should refrain from putting chametz and honey in any of our carbonot. So he says, for example, that the whole motivation behind avoiding chametz in our carbonot is an issue of avodah zarah. That's what we're really talking about. And if you take that idea and then project it back onto our verse, that's what we're really trying to avoid when we avoid chametz during Pesach. It's a link with avodah zarah. And by the way, the link is actually fairly strong if you think about it for just a moment. Rabbi Menachem Kasher has a book called the Torah Shlema, and in it he lists at least 6 ways that our relationship with chametz is parallel to our relationship with avodah zarah. You want to guess some of the 6 ways? Right? With avodah zarah, there's no bitul, there's no nullification, right? You can't say, there's 60 parts of something kosher, but this is avodah zarah. Avodah zarah, right? If you can never be canceled out. What other things? There's also mitzvahs of not being able to have it in your presence, right? Other things, you can have ham in your house, right? There's no prohibition. I don't know why you would have it in your house, but you can have ham in your house. You can't, during Pesach, have chametz in your house, and you can't ever have avodah zarah, meaning, again, there's the link. Let me just mention a few other things. What? Well, the punishment for the Pesach is complicated, because many of the prohibitions of chametz are serious prohibitions, but they are they don't require an action. Like, for example, let's say you have your chametz in your house. And so all of a sudden, Pesach comes along and you didn't get rid of your chametz. So you didn't do anything, right? So it's hard to receive a punishment, say the rabbis, for not doing something. Now, what the Rambam writes is you actually get lashes, right, for, they call them rebellion lashes. And the Beit Din will determine exactly how many you would get. But Avodah Zarah is different. Avodah Zarah is actually death, right? Avodah Zarah is so they are different in their punishments, but they do have but the Karban Pesach, it's not Chametz, is more like, because there the punishment is karet, and it's only one, actually there's two, we spoke about this previously. There are two mitzvot, when you don't do something, you can still be punished at a serious level of karet, and that was not eating the Karban Pesach and not getting Brit Milah. Okay, so I'll just give you some of the other ones. Both you have an obligation of destroying, right? You know, we don't simply say the Avodah Zarah you can put outside your house and you're finished. No, you actually have to destroy that Avodah Zarah. Chametz, we're going to come back to that. Is there a mitzvah or is there not a mitzvah to destroy chametz? It's a question. We destroy it, right? We burn chametz. But it's actually a question that we're going to have to look at. Both have the isur of hana'ah. There's a prohibition of actually enjoying any benefit from that, right? You can have hana'ah, if, for example, treif meat, you can give as a gift to a non-Jew. But you can't give as a gift avodah zarah, you know, and you can't give as a gift chametz, right? You're not allowed to benefit from it. Selling chametz is a whole other story that we'll actually have to think about seriously. There's an interesting shayla that came up that I was reading from when selling of chametz first began. And it was beginning in Europe, and one of the things that happened is to make it a real serious, because it should be a real sale, so someone sued the local Jewish community, because if it's a real sale, what do real sales often include? Real merchandise, okay. From the governmental point of view? Taxes. So you had to put a stamp on any contract, and you paid for that stamp. I mean, this is, you know, from the 17 and 1800s. And so there was a lawsuit brought that I was just going over it actually last night, because if it's a real sale, then you have to pay taxes on that. And you're paying taxes on the goods, not necessarily how much you sell it for. Now, obviously, no one wants to pay taxes on something that you're not really trying to sell. So they had to get permission, and they did actually in this tshuva get permission from the king, who they had to explain everything that they're doing and explaining, and he gave them a tax benefit as a result of that. Okay, so also in Torah, mixtures, right? You can't have chametz in mixtures, it's still prohibited, and avodah zarah in mixtures. And the last one, which is interesting, we have a positive, affirmative obligation to search out our homes, right? The verse says, "Lo yimatzeh," you should not have found in your homes any chametz. And on that verse, the rabbis say, well, "Lo yimatzeh," what's the source of that? What's the idea? If it cannot be found in your homes, if it cannot be found in homes, it means that you had to actually search for it. Nothing is not found, or nothing is found unless it's also searched. And then interestingly, the source, the pasuk for supporting that idea, that you actually have to affirmatively go and search, is with Yosef, right? When Yosef puts the goblet in Binyamin's sack, it says, and the person, the representative of Yosef came, and he searched from the oldest to the youngest, and it was found. And so since the words searched and found are in that same verse, therefore there is a mitzvah to search. That's the source of that. We have to actually search out for our chametz, which is an interesting idea if you think about it, because what does it mean we're doing when we're searching out our chametz? We are, in a sense, right, if you think about the whole global nature of that story, it's the reunion of the brothers. Right? It's Yosef planted that in order to get them to come back, in order to bring Yehuda down. It's right, all orchestrated, this search, to bring Am Yisrael together. And Shlomo Carlebach, for example, says that's what you're doing when you're searching for the crumbs on Erev Pesach. He says, people don't think crumbs are important. He says, crumbs are very, very important. He says, particularly, for example, in our relationships with other people, our relationships with our spouses, for example, it's the crumbs. It's the small little things that you don't think of that sort of grow over time, that you didn't take advantage of, you didn't correct when they were just a crumb, and then they grow into something like chametz, grows larger and larger and becomes more and more problematic. So you have to be careful with that. He says, so searching for chametz is this concept of finding ways of trying to reconnect with fellow Jews. Or you could even say, how did that goblet get inside the sack? Yosef put it there. And it basically, therefore, is we are also looking for things that we ourselves put in our homes, or we ourselves put in ourselves. Meaning the search for chametz is not an external search. The search for chametz is really an internal search, something that we ourselves are responsible for having in ourselves that we have to try to get rid of. So that's on the mitzvah of lo yimatzeh, that there's a relationship between Pesach and chametz on one hand and idol worship. Because there is also mitzvah, when you come to Eretz Yisrael, says the Rambam, in Chutz La'aretz, if there's a Avodah Zarah around you, you can sort of turn a blind eye. If it's in your presence, you have to destroy it. But you don't have to search it out. However, when you are in Eretz Yisrael, the Rambam says when the Jews first came, they had to actually search out. They had to sort of look under every rock and stone and behind doors to find any type of idol worship that there was, and they had to actually search for it and then destroy it. And so there too, chametz and idol worship are very much interlinked. So one of the things that perhaps is taking place on Seder night, and we're not eating chametz, is we're in a sense reminding ourselves about Avodah Zarah, that we have to, in a sense, reject the Avodah Zarah that took place in Egypt, right? That's the Rambam's connecting the honey and the leaven, and we are running away from that. And that's one of the things that we are doing as our first act. If you go back to Kiddush HaChodesh, the mitzvah that I spoke about a few times ago, about before the Jews could be morally free, politically free, they had to be morally free, that they can become whoever they wish to become. And here too, before the Jews can be free, they have to sort of shake off any of the slavery to Avodah Zarah, because that's what Avodah Zarah is. It's slavery to falsehood. And they had to shake that off before they could become free. There's an interesting aside also about Avodah Zarah and Egyptian society. When did bread become bread? Where's the first bread? It certainly probably came as sort of a surplus of beer. Beer was, probably the first sort of technological leap that agriculturalists made, is that they were able to find a liquid that wouldn't go bad, right? Remember, in the ancient world, food went bad right away. So beer was a first innovation, that it didn't go bad right away, and probably as a surplus of the production, people then started uncovering the value of sort of leavening. And until that point in time, that people just had matzah, more or less matzah or gruel or something along those lines. So the Encyclopedia Encarta, I just sort of looked up quickly, they believe that the manufacturing of yeast and leavening began in Egyptian society and was a state secret. It was one of the things that made Egypt what Egypt was. That was like one of the things they were most proud of, one of their greatest technological advances, and you can see how proud it is in the Torah itself, because we have a couple of examples. We know the Egyptians didn't like herders, right? When the brothers come down, it says the roet son, those who are shepherds, is, abominable to the Egyptians. But it also says in a few places that when the Jews would sit down to eat, the Egyptians would not break bread with them. Right? When Yosef's brothers come in, it says that they had to eat separately because the Egyptians did not want to eat bread with them. And you even have a more, I think, stronger instance that the making of bread was an incredibly powerful part of Egyptian society, and that is with Yosef and Potiphar. Do you remember the verse when it speaks about Yosef and his relationship with Potiphar? He trusts him with everything. He gives to him everything in his household, but he doesn't give him the control of bread. The bread making was sort of a technological advancement that had to be kept secret and private and only for the Egyptians themselves. which connects to the concept of Avodah Zarah, because part of the Egyptian Avodah Zarah, as we spoke about another time, is this celebration of its technology, its chariots, its power, that I am great, and all these things. So that's another thing that the Jews perhaps were rejecting. As they leave Egypt, they eat this plain, simple matzah as a rejection of this form of worship, self-worship, of how great you are in terms of technology. There's also another sort of tantalizing way of thinking about that. I don't know if the Jews had leavened bread before they left Egypt or not. If it was kept a secret and it was not given to them, perhaps they had never eaten it. More likely they had eaten it. Eventually the Egyptians kept the secret of how to make it, but they provided it to everyone else. And if that's the case, think about the powerful statement they were making, that our first day of freedom, it's better not to rely on the power and the greatness of Egyptian society and eat their bread, but rather our own simple bread. It's better to be free and poor, as it were, than a slave and rich and be able to eat that. The other possibility with regards to making bread, anyone make their own bread here? Challah, okay. So I don't know if challah is significant, but I know that people who make their own sourdough bread, right? They love to keep their starter, right? There are people who have passed down starters. It's very difficult in the Jewish world because you have to get rid of your yeast starter every year. But there are people outside of the Jewish world, I've heard stories that they've passed it down for 3 generations. Their yeast starter, that it's something very special about it. And if that's true, that you had to have this sort of starter that you pass down from generation to generation to generation, one of the things that matzah and getting rid of chametz would have said is a fresh start. As important as this heritage is, they call it heritage starter actually, important as this tradition is of always keep that. One of the things about leaven and yeast is not simply that it rises, but it's also something that is protected and built on that which came before it, right? And they save a piece of the yeast and they put it away for the next time it's going to be used. And Pesach says, no, you get rid of that. You get rid of looking backwards, and now you begin to look forwards. Okay. Let's turn back to the Sefer and look at the Sefer Chinuch, back to the sources, and see about 1 or 2 more explanations of what chametz might be. Thus far, we've spoken about alacrity, zirizus lemitzvah. We've spoken about getting rid of avodah zarah, and now the last paragraph of the Sefer Chinuch. This is still in Mitzvah 117, where he's talking about not bringing it for carbonot. And I have further heard a reason about the prohibition of leaven and honey, because leaven raises itself, and honey likewise brings up a foam, and therefore we are distanced from us, they were distanced from us, to hint that an abomination to the Lord is every haughty person. Pride, right? You've heard. Chametz is pride. It's in the middle of the second page. And I saw further in the commentary, the Rambam, may his memory be blessed, who wrote, and this is his language, and since the sacrifices are for the will of the glorious God, they should not come from things that have a strong hand to change the nature of things. That's a double entendre. There's that the leaven and the honey should not change, right, the taste of the carbon, but more than that, that a person who is proud will change the nature of the service to God because he feels that he is right. We can think of a million different reasons why pride is a difficult quality as you're leaving Egypt to maintain your relationship with God. If you feel that you're great and wonderful, so then you don't feel you have a need to rely on God. You don't feel you have a need to rely on other Jews, which is a big part of the experience as you're leaving as a people and forming a people. You don't feel as you enter into Eretz Yisrael, you feel that it's through your hands that you have built, right, this land. By Shavuos is not just about the bread that is brought in the carbonot, it's also the time of the first fruits. And you might bring these first fruits and say, it's through me, through my greatness, through my hand. Pride is against building a land as well. Pride is against learning Torah, right? If you think you're wonderful and great and know everything, so you're not going to ask questions, as Pirkei Avot says, right? You can't be a bore and learn. You have to be prepared to ask questions, and you can't be proud and be someone who's learning. So pride is obviously something that we have to get rid of if we want to be successful as a people. And in addition to pride, we also have to get rid of what's the other sort of related concept to pride? The Yetzer Hara, right? You've heard Chametz is your Yetzer Hara. That's also a connection. One of the sources, the direct source of that is the Gemara in Brachot. Rav Alexandri would pray, and at the end of his tefillah, every single time he would finish his tefillah, we have prayers we have statements at the end of our tefillot, right? Elokai Netzor, right at the end of the Shemona Esrei, we say that's Rabbi Huda's prayer, that he would sort of remind himself not to speak bad of other people. That's his prayer that became so popular, we now all say it. So Rav Alexandri had his prayer. His prayer was, Ribono Shel Olam, it is revealed and known before you that our will is to perform your will. And what prevents us from performing your will? On the one hand, it is the yeast in the dough, the Yetzer Hara, that is written within every person. And the second, the subjugation of the kingdoms on the other hand. Meaning there are two things that prevent us. One is slavery, physical slavery. And second, he says, yeast in the dough, the Yetzer Hara. It's a direct link between the Yetzer Hara and, of course, and Chametz. So as we're about to be set free, we have to have the sense of humility. We have to reject the Yetzer Hara. We have to want to do the will of God. Rav Hirsch puts it, I think, in a sort of a positive spin. He says, what does Chametz do? What does the leavening do? He says it's actually a good thing. It's freedom, right? When you grow to your full potential. He says that's a very positive thing. It's the wealthy man's bread that he has fulfilled his potential. The problem is that when the Jews are leaving Egypt, they're not yet fulfilled. They shouldn't think of themselves as complete. They shouldn't view themselves as totally independent. They are still bound by their relationship with God. They became free of Egyptian society, but the only way they're going to make it is they still view themselves as slaves to God. And so therefore that's what we're rejecting when it comes to the Chametz. Now all this, though, raises, I think, the specter of the questions, the second question we began with. If Chametz is pride, if it's Yetzer Hara, why in the world would you want it at other times of the year? Why is it an obligation on Shavuot itself? So there's a couple of different ways of looking at that. One is I just want to show you inside the halacha sources that there is a dispute about Chametz, that there is potentially at least hinted at a good side, and then we'll maybe talk outside a little bit. So the last two sources on the source sheet, I just took two halachic issues that come up from time to time, and see that there's actually two sides to the two sides to the opinion, two opinions. So the first, if you see where it says Bal Yira'eh and Bal Yimatzeh, right? We've already spoken about that. You can't have in your presence and you can't see it. Now, is that the same mitzvah? Meaning, if you see it, it's in your presence, right? So I guess the one exception might be is it's possible that it's in your presence, but you don't see it. So is it one and the same, or are they different? So there's, as usual, a machloket about that question. The Rosh says as follows: one is in violation of the Bal Yira'eh, that you're not allowed to see it, even if one does not see the Chametz. What's the proof for that? For the Torah did not write, you shall not see Chametz. It says, shall not be seen. Lo yimatzeh. It will not be seen. So that means you shall not have any Chametz in a place that is capable of being seen. Even if you don't see it, if you could see it, that's a problem. Right? You know, the supermarkets, they always cover their Chametz. So that would not fit with the Rush. But it does fit with the Kesef Mishnah. Kesef Mishnah says below, commenting on the Rambam. The Kesef Mishnah is Rav Yosef Karo. His comments on the Rambam ultimately become the Shulchan Aruch. It appears to me that the phrase shall not be seen implies that the violation is committed only when the Chametz is actually seen by the eyes. But if the Chametz is hidden away, and his language is tamun, hidden. Very often tamun has a feeling, a sense of tamun is a treasure. It's hidden away for the future. That's very often the understanding of that word. But anyway, if the chametz is hidden, one transgresses only the Bal Yamatzeh, that it shouldn't be found. So he disagrees, and so the supermarkets have something to rely on in the Kesef Mishnah. If you can't see it, you don't have a problem with that. What you see from this is, at least according to the Kesef Mishnah, chametz may not always be bad, right? It's hidden away, potentially, for some future value. The second halachic source is from the Mishnah. The Mishnah in Psachim says as follows: Kol sha'ah shemutar le'echol. Now it's talking about Erev Pesach. When are you allowed to still eat chametz, and then when do you have to stop giving up chametz? That's the first part of the Mishnah. In the English. With regard to the manner of the removal of leavened bread, Rabbi Yehuda says, I didn't translate everything in the Mishnah. The Mishnah says that you're allowed to eat up to the right time, and you can serve chametz to your animals, your domesticated animals, your non-domesticated, to birds and the like. You can sell to a non-Jew. All this is permissible, also with the benefit, until the time passes. Once the time has passed, then you no longer can do so. Then the Mishnah continues on, and that's what I've translated in the English below. With regard to the manner of removal of leavened bread, right? What do we talk about removal of leavened bread? Right? You find it, and what do you have to now do with the chametz on Erev Pesach? So one possibility is burn it. What's the other possibility? Okay, sell it also, but sell it, let's say, is biblically.
What's the difference? You have to get rid of it. How can you sell it?
All right, so selling is a whole interesting question, but leave selling just for a moment to the side. But what you either have to wait. People will say you have to get rid of it. So you can burn it. People have always told me the best way of getting rid of it is to eat it. That's a great way. What's the other thing you can? So here's the Mishnah. Here's the argument. Rabbi Yehuda says the removal of leavened bread is to be accomplished only through burning. That's the only thing that you're allowed to do. Burn it. The rabbis say burning is not required. You may crumble it, and you can throw it into the wind. You can cast it in the sea. Get it out of your domain. The Minchas Chinuch, by the way, picks up on this idea and runs with it. And he says, according to Rabbi Yehuda, then, you have to burn it. He says that means it's a positive mitzvah, right? That's the difference. Do you have to burn it? It means it's a positive mitzvah. Or is it simply something you just have to get rid of? It's not as positive. What would be the nafkamina? The nafkamina would be, do you have to go out and buy chametz? Let's say you have no chametz in your house. Let's say your kids eat all the chametz. It's now Erev Pesach. If you just have to throw it in the wind, you don't have an obligation. You don't have chametz in your house. That's it. You're free. You don't have to do anything further. But if you hold like Rabbi Yehuda and you have to actually burn it, so positive mitzvah. The Minchas Chinuch says we learn this because we burn the sacrifices when they're left over. He says you have to actually burn it. So if you actually have to burn it, you have to actually go out and buy. And the Minchas Chinuch says it's like a tzitzit. You never really have an obligation to wear tzitzit if you don't have a four-cornered garment. But what's the custom that we've developed? You buy a four-cornered garment in order to put tzitzit on them. He says, so we also go out of our way to buy the chametz in order to search it. You could say for the reasons we've already spoken about, right? You're searching it in the same way there's a value in the search. But he says you have to actually go out and buy this. So the other opinion, though, the rabbinic opinion, is what's interesting to me. Rabbi Yehuda says chametz is bad, you have to destroy it. The rabbis say no. You throw it in the wind. Now what happens when it's thrown in the wind? It goes somewhere, but it's not destroyed. It's going to be eaten by birds. It's going to have some potential life after Pesach. And so both of these instances, this Mishnah as well as the one the Bal Yamatzeh suggest that chametz has some future purpose, some future potential, and that's what I want to end with. I'm sorry, I'm running a minute or two late. Yeah, so you know what? Yeah, next week I'll try to spend a few minutes on selling because I know it's a big topic. So. Right. So, yes. So I told this story in shul on Shabbat, It's, I think, a very powerful story. Viktor Yushchenko was running for the presidency in the Ukraine in 2004, and he was guaranteed to win. He was sort of running against the establishment, the dictators, the regime, and he had a great deal of support. In the morning of the elections, it was clear that he was going to win. By the way, they really wanted to stop him on many different levels. They tried to poison him, they tried to assassinate him, they disfigured his face, but he still ran, and it was clearly that he won, meaning all the exit polls showed that he was a runaway victor. But the state controlled all of the media outlets, and they told the state journalists, you have to report that the regime has won again, that Viktor Yushchenko, the one who is challenging, has lost. So that's what they're reporting on the news, and none of the journalists would change that story. But then what happened? 2004, they have the person in the corner of the screen, the person who is signing to the deaf community the news, translating the news. And what does she say? So her name was Natalia Dickermont, and she's signing that what they are saying now to everyone else is a lie. It's not true. Viktor Yushchenko won. I'm embarrassed to say that they're lying. I don't accept it. She got all of the deaf community to start texting everyone else and saying it's not true, and there was an alternative news source out there, and then people started to get more and more information. Then you had tens of thousands of people starting marching in Kiev. You have the Orange Revolution, and eventually Viktor Yushchenko becomes the president. So one of the ways I understand that story... What? That's... No, it's a very fascinating story. She's one of, so one of the things that I like about the story is the mission of the Jewish people is that woman in the corner. You know, we don't always control the main screen. The main screen of what people in this world view as important, whether it's wealth or fame or power, that's the main screen that's, most people are, the diet they're being fed. We're in the small corner saying there's something called truth, there's something called God, there's something called meaning, and we're revolutionary in a sense, trying to eventually get all our other people to text message to sort of create this revolution. The Jewish people have a mission of being a very small corner of the screen to have an impact on the entire world. If you want to fulfill that mission, you have to have a certain amount of chutzpah. You have to have a certain amount of pride. You have to have a certain amount of self-confidence to believe that your message is actually important enough for the whole world to hear. So when we are receiving our freedom, right, we need to have the structure. We can't just have just total freedom with anarchy. That's what Leavened, that's what Chametz is. It just grows without any controls whatsoever. You can't have that. But if you have Torah that controls that growth, that's why you can have, of course, the Chametz on Shavuos. If you have the Torah that controls that, that's a positive. Also, as I mentioned before, when we come to Eretz Yisrael is also the first fruits. It's this idea that we have to build up an entire nation. So to build up an entire nation, you need a sense of pride. You need the belief that you can have a big impact on the world. You have to yourself start off humble, but in the back of that humility has to have a tremendous amount of confidence. And I would say it's the same thing with the Yetzer Hara as we spoke about at the very end. If the Yetzer Hara is, to use the analogy I used last week, the elephant, and the Yetzer Tov is the rider trying to direct the elephant, the rider does not want to get off the Yetzer Hara, because then you're walking. You will only have a certain amount of impact on the world. You need to be able to channel that Yetzer Hara, that elephant, to be able to really move things and accomplish many different things. So Chametz we want to destroy on Pesach, but not totally, because eventually we're going to need that Chametz to fulfill our ultimate mission. Have a good week.